Today we're going to go ahead and talk about events leading to the American Revolution. One of the earliest events, one of the earliest things that really sparked the colonists' ire against the English was the Proclamation of 1763, which followed the French and Indian War. The Proclamation of 1763 basically states that colonists weren't allowed to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. The reason why Great Britain did this is because the French and Indian War cost a lot of money, it was expensive, and they didn't want to risk another conflict with the Native Americans. So, in order to help protect their colonies, they wanted to keep the colonists west of the Appalachians. So, it was really meant to prevent trouble with the Indians. The colonists, on the other hand, didn't see it that way. They viewed this as an effort by the British to keep a closer eye and to keep closer control of what was going on in the colonies. In other words, to limit their freedom. The problem with this ultimately was that it was unenforceable. So the colonists didn't want to really abide by it, and England couldn't really make them. And so the colonists began to see British law as weak and began to see British law as contrary to their own interests. And this is a huge shift in colonial thinking that really leads directly into the American Revolution. Another side result of the French and Indian War was the fact that Great Britain went heavily into debt to defend the colonies. And a lot of folks in Great Britain felt like if we're going to spend all this money to defend the colonies should help pay for it. And so Parliament passes a series of legislation meant to achieve that end, for the colonists to help pay for their own defense. The first was the Sugar Act of 1764, which taxes, as the name would suggest, sugar. There was also a Quartering Act of 1765. After the French and Indian War, Britain saw the need to keep soldiers in the colonies, and in order to defray the cost of protecting the colonies, of keeping the soldiers there, they required that colonists house and feed British soldiers, so the British government didn't have to do it. And again, another way of basically taxing the colonists, of making them help to pay for their own defense. One of the more controversial pieces of legislation that was meant to raise funds from the colonies was the Stamp Act of 1765. Basically, it taxed legal documents, and that's almost anything that was printed, newspaper, birth certificates, you name it. If it was printed, it was supposed to be printed on special paper that had received a special stamp. The big thing about this particular piece of legislation that really ticked off the colonists, though, wasn't so much the taxes, it was how violators would be prosecuted. They would be tried not in the colonial courts, which were usually sympathetic to the colonists, but rather in admiralty courts, which were courts run by the British Navy. So the number of colonists who were convicted and sent to jail under this new law, the Stamp Act of 1765, would be much greater than prior pieces of legislation. This is one of the things that really ticked the colonists off. They also viewed all of this as taxation without representation. In other words, it wasn't so much that they minded paying for their defense, they probably were okay with that. They just wanted to be able to have a say in what the taxes were going to be. If you're going to take my money, you should at least ask. At least that was the way the colonists felt about it. I don't think Great Britain necessarily saw it that way. In particular, one group of colonists that really didn't see it that way became known as the Sons of Liberty. They were a political activist group from New England that really advocated for independence. They felt like there were a series of abuses, all of these laws and legislation, the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, were all really just evidence that England no longer should be governing the colonies. In fact, the colonies should be seen as independent and should in fact have their independence. They were led by the likes of Samuel Adams, and again were active primarily in New England. Another thing that really starts to push the United States towards, or the colonies, I guess I should say, towards becoming the United States, is the Boston Massacre. It's used very effectively by the Sons of Liberty as propaganda for the revolutionaries. I think it's fair to say that it wasn't really a massacre in the sense that a lot of people died, and it wasn't really a massacre in the sense that the civilians who were killed were not exactly so innocent. There were a group of rowdy dock workers who showed up outside of British barracks and were shouting insults and throwing snowballs and rocks at guys with guns. Probably not the best idea. However, it was a massacre in the sense that the British soldiers who were trained to fight, who were armed with guns, did shoot at colonists who were not trained to fight and who did not have guns. And so certainly in that sense, the British used overwhelming, disproportionate force. against the colonists, and thus probably the name massacre. Nonetheless, uses propaganda for the revolutionaries and does work as such. It really does spark the colonial resentment towards Great Britain. The Gaspee then is a British schooner type of ship. A schooner is a type of ship, and it had been sent over. It was a naval ship. It had been sent over with a mission to catch smugglers coming in and out of the colonies. Unfortunately, the captain of the Gaspee allowed his crew, when they stopped a colonial vessel, to board the ship and to take from the colonists. They destroyed colonial property, again, took colonial property, and so the colonists saw the Gaspee as a sign of British oppression, and they absolutely hated it. Unfortunately for the crew of the Gaspee, they ran aground June 9th, 1772, just off the coast of Massachusetts, within sight of the beach, easily within reach of the beach. And so the colonists, most of them being familiar with the sea, it doesn't take long before they realize the Gaspee's run aground, and they row out to it in rowboats, and they basically burn it down to the waterline. They completely destroy the boat. Now they're seen as destroying royal property. And again, this further serves to go ahead and weaken the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. Some of the last things that really drive us towards revolution: the Boston Tea Party. It was a protest in response to a tea monopoly held by the East India Company. The way it basically worked was the colonial tea companies had to pay taxes on the tea that they imported, but the East India Company did not, so that gave them a competitive advantage, and it's one of the things that allowed them to maintain their monopoly over tea throughout the British Empire. They had this special privilege. And so the colonists got ticked off at this, and they decided they were going to send the tea back to England. And so the dock workers refused to unload English tea, or tea that was imported by the East India Company, from the ships that had docked in Boston. But England told the ships you couldn't go back, you had to stay there until the tea was unloaded. So they sat there for a while, and eventually the colonists decided, okay, if you don't want to take the tea back, we're just going to go ahead and get rid of it. So on December 16th, 1773, a group of colonists, dressed up as Native Americans, crudely dressed up as Native Americans from all accounts, rowed across to the harbor, and they proceeded to dump 15,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. The British are furious. So in response to this act, in response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passes the Intolerable Acts. They decide Boston is just not manageable. What they go ahead and do, according to the Intolerable Acts, they close the port of Boston. They shut it down. This deprives a lot of people in Boston of their livelihood. They also state that royal officials in charge in New England, would be tried not in the colonies, but rather back in England. So in other words, if the royal officials, guys who worked for the king, did something wrong and abused the colonists, they were a lot less likely to be convicted because they were going all the way back to England to get tried. Further, the governor of Massachusetts, who had traditionally been elected by the colonists themselves, would now be appointed by the king. Again, the colonists had gotten used to ruling themselves, and this was completely unacceptable to them. They made town meetings absolutely illegal, so you couldn't get together to voice your grievances. They put together a new quartering act, so now the British soldiers, again, there were more of them that had to be housed, and there were more requirements on the people who housed them. And Massachusetts last was put under martial law, meaning that the British military basically governed Massachusetts. All of these things just served to further irritate and further exacerbate an already difficult situation, especially in the colony of Massachusetts, which was definitely kind of seen as the problem child of the colonies.